Hello, human biology students. The last unit that we're going to cover is the musculoskeletal system. So obviously combining the muscular system and the skeletal system. Again, just doing a super quick overview. The skeletal system, obviously we're talking about bones and also those joints that allow for movement of bones. And then we'll talk about muscle contraction. And again, just the basics. That's all we have time for here. So, major functions of the skeletal system, supporting the body, protection. So think of all your heart and lungs and everything inside of that rib cage that is protected from the skeletal system. And this is important. Your skeletal system is actually responsible for the production of your blood cells. So inside of your bones, you have marrow, bone marrow, and that's actually where blood cells are produced, including red blood cells and your immune cells, the many different kinds of immune cells. It's obviously we store some minerals like calcium and phosphate, also some fat stored in there. And we know that the skeletal system is responsible for movement, right? So not just protection, but also movement of our limbs. We break the skeletal system down into two main parts. The first is the axial skeleton. And I always remember axial because it's the central axis, right? So it's the like the spinal column and skull, and the rib cage, and then there's this hyoid bone, and it looks like they're kind of pointing at the jaw here, but really they're not. The hyoid bone is really unique. It's actually a bone it's the only bone in the body that's really not connected to another bone. It's beneath your chin, and it's just kind of a floating bone. And again, it's unique. It's really the only one that is that way. So the skull, go up a little bit. So the skull or the cranium is actually composed of many different plates that fuse together. They're not necessarily fused together at birth, most of them, but as we age, or as a baby grows and ages, eventually those become fused together. So technically, there's 8 separate bones. I am not going to expect you to memorize those. We just don't have time necessarily to do that, but just understand that there are all of these different bones that do, the occipital, parietal is really the largest, temporal around the temple, that kind of makes sense. Frontal at the front, so some of them are like really obvious. Lacrimal is that eye socket area. There's a bone on the inside of that. Maxilla is, what your upper jaw really is. So the front, yeah, this bone here, that is the upper jaw, and then the mandible is our lower jaw. Oh, and I guess it says this a little in detail here. I forgot that. So hyoid bone is the only bone that does not articulate, and by articulate we mean attach in some way or work with in some way. It's free floating, so it's just not attached to anything else. And when we look at our spinal column, or those vertebrae that make up our backbone, because there are so many, there are 33, we actually do separate them into different sections. And I'm not going to have you memorize how many are in each section or either the section. I think it is important to understand that. So when we talk about cervical vertebrae, we're talking about the vertebrae near the neck, the thoracic. So think of our thoracic cavity, which is that heart and lung area or cavity. Lumbar, you hear a lot about lumbar support in, I don't know, maybe you guys don't, but if you do office work of any type, they talk about lumbar support. And actually, when you buy cars now, car seats have really evolved to take into account that lumbar area. And then the sacrum, these are actually the sacrum and the coccyx are both uh, fused. So these are actually not movable. This we sometimes call the coccyx your tailbone. And in between these are what we call discs, which is really cartilage. And we know that as we age, those discs tend to deteriorate, which is a concern for people as they get older. It's also the disc can be damaged sometimes just from physical injuries. So sometimes people have had injuries that have maybe torn or um, you know misplaced or unaligned these discs, and it can be very painful and also very debilitating. And as I mentioned earlier, the ribs, of course, are for protection. Some are attached to this mid bone called the sternum, and some are we say are floating and not attached to anything. The sternum we also call the breastbone. The appendicular skeleton is all about the appendages that are not part of that central core. So the appendicular skeleton includes we would say the pelvic girdle, and also includes the arms and legs, and so we're talking about the pectoral girdle up here as well, that collarbones and shoulder blade portion. I mentioned earlier in articulation is any place in which two bones are joined, so they articulate in some way. I think that's an important term. So I already mentioned pectoral girdle. So the scapula is the shoulder blade. I always remember scapula is flat like a spatula, so that's kind of the way that I always remember that one. And then the clavicle is that collarbone. You can see why people, I don't know, I feel like I've known a few people who've had like four-wheeler injuries and those kinds of things in my life. And it seems like the collarbone is the one that gets broken. But look, I mean, it's thin and think of, yeah, how that would break a little easier than, say, the shoulder blade, right? And yeah, this upper limb or the appendicular skeleton includes, we said upper limbs and lower limbs. So upper limbs, the humerus. This is why sometimes when you hit your elbow, so this would be your, right here would be kind of your elbow point. When you hit your elbow, sometimes you say, oh, I've hit my funny bone. And it's not funny. It actually hurts really, really bad. Uh, and then the radius and ulna. So you just have the one upper arm bone, the humerus, and then the lower arm is the radius and the ulna. How do you know? I mean, this looks confusing when you look at it. I always remember that the radius is connected to the thumb. The thumb, we have opposable thumbs. I always say I can move my thumb in a complete circle. So I can radiate my thumb in that way. And so I always remember that the radius aligns with the thumb and the ulna is the one on the other side. Metacarpal, so you have carpals, metacarpals as we start moving toward fingers, and then the actual fingers are called the phalanges. Metacarpals, because you use your hands to drive a car. That's one really good way to remember it. Pelvic girdle, we're just gonna, I'm gonna skip through that just because we're gonna run out of time here. Lower limb, I think this is more important. Femur is the largest long bone for sure of the body. Patella, we're looking at that knee. And then the lower leg, again, just like the arms, it is split into two. So we have the tibia and fibula. And the way that I remember which is the larger one and which is the smaller one, and the larger one is on the inside, and the smaller one is on the outside, which I think more the almost calf area, if you will. Um, I remember that fibula is the smaller one because you tell a little fib. That's seriously the way I remember, or that I learned to remember them and memorize them. Tarsals, metatarsals, and again, phalanges, just like the fingers. Metatarsals, because you walk on the tar with your feet, right? So carpals and metacarpals are hands for driving cars. Tarsals and metatarsals are feet because you walk on the tar with your feet. I think it's important. Obviously, bone is made of specialized cells. Sometimes people almost forget a little bit that bone because it's that hardened structure. They're very much alive, right? So if you break a bone, it's going to repair itself, hopefully. As you get older, that happens at a slower pace than when you're young. But yeah, they are made of tissue. They're a matrix of minerals, salts, some collagen fibers, and specialized cells. So we're not going to talk about the anatomy of all the bone types, but I do think it's worth talking about the anatomy of long bones. So we break them into parts. So the diaphysis is the main long shaft of the bone. And then of course we have on each end, usually it articulates with a joint, right? We call this end the epiphysis. I'm gonna go down and make sure I don't, okay. So we have that epiphysis on both ends. And there's something in here called the epiphyseal plate. That is actually, we also call that commonly the growth plate. When you're young and growing, we say the epiphyseal plate is open and still expanding. And when you're done growing, that kind of fuses in place, and so with an x-ray they can tell if you're still growing or if you're done growing. If you're a girl, you're probably done growing in height at 14, not always, but most of the time. That's kind of the average. For guys, you can be growing until you're 20. Not uncommon for men to grow after high school into early adulthood. So some of you may very likely still have open growth plates and still be growing. On the end, we have this articular cartilage. Remember, this is where it articulates with another bone. So we have cartilage on the end so that it's that smooth end. As you get older, again, this kind of degrades, and there can be a lot of pain associated in joints with that. I think it's important for our bone marrow. We have two different kinds. We have yellow bone marrow, red bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow, primarily for storing fat. Red bone marrow, this is all about making those blood cells. Making of the blood cells, this is found in spongy bone. Okay. So that's where most of the blood cells are made. And then that periosteum, the living outer covering of fibrous connective tissue, and ligaments. So we talk about in bone structures and in muscle structures, we talk about ligaments versus tendons. Ligaments connect bones to bones. Tendons connect muscles to bones. That's the difference between the two. If those tendons that connect muscle to bone, remember your Achilles tendon, right? Connects that muscle to bone, and if it gets severed, you can't walk. And this is all we're going to cover for skeletal system.